About 30 minutes outside of downtown Chicago, there's a big white brick building with teal domes and security on either side of the entrance.
Okay, why don't you tell us where we are right now?
Okay, so we are at the Mosque Foundation in Little Palestine. This is a key part of the community. This is one of the biggest mosques in the country, and we're here just ahead of Friday prayer. So it is packed.
That's Yasmin Abu Talib. She is a White House reporter. And earlier this summer, she was standing outside of the mosque with audio producer Ariel Plotnick.
I have been to many Friday prayers. I have not seen many, if any, that I've seen that are this large. This is a really big mosque.
The mosque is the centerpiece of a neighborhood called Little Palestine. Little Palestine is in Bridgeview, Illinois, and it's home to one of the country's largest concentrations of Palestinian Americans. It's also a stronghold for Democrats. In the 2020 election, the county this neighborhood is in voted overwhelmingly for President Joe Biden. But now, Yasmin says, people in Little Palestine are seriously questioning their allegiance to the Democratic Party because of how the Biden administration has approached the war in Gaza. That's the case for Deanna Osman, who spoke to Yasmin and Ariel across from the mosque.
I think for the country, they need to see the Democratic Party is not just, is not the progressive sort of organization that it pretends to be, and that there's very little difference along party lines between the Republicans and the Democrats, and I think that's something our community is finally realizing.
There's a lot of grief and anger at how long the war has gone on and what they view as President Biden's unfettered support of Israel and his unwillingness to condition or cut off offensive weapons.
Polls show that for many Americans deciding who to vote for in November, the war in Gaza is a low priority. But for Muslim and Arab American communities, many of whom have families still in the Middle East, the war is the single most important issue. And that's the case regardless of who is at the top of the Democratic ticket.
This community, I think, is indicative in many ways of communities in key states that we're watching very closely. I have been to Michigan a number of times this year because they have one of the country's largest Arab and Muslim population, and they do have the ability to swing the vote. And even in other key states that we're maybe not paying as much attention to, there are pretty sizable Arab and Muslim communities that have really tried to make very clear that their votes are not a given based on the way the administration has dealt with Israel's war in Gaza.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Tuesday, August 13th. Next week is a big week for Democrats. The Democratic National Convention will be held in Chicago. It's a week-long party that will end with the coronation of Vice President Kamala Harris as the official presidential nominee. But while delegates and politicians celebrate Democrats inside a huge downtown arena, some voters in nearby Little Palestine will be protesting. They say the party seriously needs to change its approach to the war in Gaza if it wants their votes. Yasmin and Ariel went to Little Palestine at a pivotal moment, the day after the presidential debate, what many think of as the beginning of the end for Biden's candidacy. And they brought back a snapshot of what voters were feeling in that moment. Feelings that, for many, haven't changed, even though the party's nominee has. So before we get into some of the conversations that you had with people in this community, I just want to lay a little bit more of the groundwork or the context to understand what this moment has meant for people. And specifically, what the Biden administration's approach to the war in Gaza has meant. Can you kind of remind us, how has the Biden administration approached the war in Gaza and approached its relationship with Israel?
So it's been a little bit of an evolving response and relationship. If listeners remember, on October 7th, Hamas launched an attack on Israel where they killed about 1,200 people and took around 250 others hostage into Gaza. And this, of course, was a very traumatic day for Israelis and for Jews across the world. And President Biden came out very quickly to condemn the attacks. And shortly after, he made a forceful speech where he committed his unwavering support to Israel.
Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas.
He gave this speech where he reiterated unconditional U.S. support.
In this moment of tragedy, I want to say to them and to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back. We'll make sure that they have the help their citizens need and they can continue to defend themselves.
He said if the U.S. had been attacked in a similar way, the response would be swift and overwhelming. And they basically gave Israel a green light to do whatever they thought they needed to do. But what ended up happening is public opinion started to turn on the war pretty quickly because hundreds of people were dying a day. Israel imposed the siege of Gaza where basically no humanitarian aid was getting in. And what you've seen is the Biden administration sort of slowly respond to that. It took them a couple months to criticize Israel at all. But then in December, you had Biden say that Israel was indiscriminately bombing in Gaza. And so you've had these little shifts, but fundamentally no change in the U.S. policy of unconditional military and diplomatic support. There have been some moments here, a single shipment of bombs that's been suspended, but ultimately the Biden administration has not imposed any conditions on its aids to Israel, and the war is now in its 10th month.
And as you pointed out, that has drawn a lot of concern and honestly anger from many Democratic voters. And we started to see that play out in the primaries with these write-in, uncommitted campaigns. Talk a little bit about that moment, about the upsurge of pushback from Democratic voters against the Biden administration and how it was handling this war.
So you're absolutely right. I think starting around February, when we started to have some of the first high-profile Democratic primaries.
The Michigan Democratic primary sent alarm bells ringing within the Democratic Party after a large contingent voted uncommitted against Joe Biden.
There was this effort that started in Michigan to vote uncommitted, which is basically you vote in your party's primary, but you're not committing to any candidate. In Michigan, they actually do have an option called uncommitted, and a couple other states have a sort of similar option, Wisconsin, Minnesota. And Michigan's effort was very successful by the organizer standards. They got 100,000 people to vote uncommitted.
Notably, 100,000 people, 13% of Democratic primary voters, went out and cast ballots for uncommitted. In Dearborn, Michigan, which is majority Arab American, 3 in 4 voters selected uncommitted, 75%.
President Biden's margin of victory in Michigan in 2020 was about 154,000 votes. And so this was organizers and some Democratic voters trying to demonstrate to the president that his unconditional support of Israel, his handling of the war, could potentially cost him the election. And from what I understand from reporting I did at the time and that I've done since, is that this did sort of wake up the Biden administration a little bit. And so you see them starting to shift their rhetoric a little bit, but ultimately not their policy. And when Ariel and I visited Little Palestine, that was very evident to them. They were sort of brushing off, criticism Biden has made of the Israeli government or, condemnation of civilian lives because they feel ultimately nothing has changed.
So take me to Little Palestine. Tell me a little bit about this place, what it's like, and what makes it special.
So Little Palestine is maybe a 30, 40-minute drive outside of Chicago. And we are in a sort of strip mall. There's a barber shop, a law office, an insurance office. This is very much a suburb. And even, you can see signs, pro-Palestine signs all over the city. There's a digital sign above the names of all the businesses, and it keeps switching between a Palestinian flag, Free Palestine. There's an American flag sort of ripped next to a Palestinian flag. You can't talk to anyone, even if we weren't sort of officially interviewing people. It's really all people want to talk about because almost everyone has a direct tie to the war. A lot of Palestinians immigrated to this community after the 1948 war, I think again after the 1967 war. And I think for a lot of people who live in this community, it is a way for them to sort of maintain a lot of ties to Palestine, Palestinian food, Palestinian community, even as they've had to leave their homeland.
So tell me a little bit more about some of the people that you got the opportunity to speak with while you were on this trip.
We spoke with the owner of a jewelry store named Fadi Sahouri. He has more distant ties to Palestine. He doesn't have direct family who is there, but he's clearly very much impacted by the war. He told us that he will have barbecues or just these ordinary days with his family that make him feel really guilty that he knows his kids are safe and can have a good meal while he knows all of this is raging over in Gaza and in many cases the West Bank.
Why am I one of the lucky ones? And why are they not? Why can't they live as safe and happy as we live here? The feeling of being on the other side of the spectrum and not being able to help and not being able to do something about it, personally, it's killing me.
He is a pretty avid Democratic Party supporter. He said he voted for Joe Biden in 2020. He's been mostly a lifelong Democrat. And I think what struck both Ariel and I was he seemed kind of pained when he was talking about this idea that he would not support Joe Biden.
I'm going to say something that might be a little bit controversial. I think the Democratic Party need to be punished for what they've done in the last year to the Middle East. They need to know that, in my opinion, from our community, from our Middle Eastern community, they need to lose the elect. I will never vote Republican. I'm a Democrat. I've always voted Democrat. But I really think they need to know that this action cannot and will not go unpunished.
And punishment meaning like they would lose the election.
Yes. I'm sorry to say, they need to realize that there are actions to their actions. And
you're making a face like you're not happy to be saying this.
I'm not, because I don't want my party to lose. I'm a Democrat. I don't want my Democratic Party to lose. I would hate for it to lose, but they've done so much wrong. They've done so much chaos in the world, and that they didn't prevent it. That to the extent that honestly, somebody needs to be liable for it, and I think it's time.
Interesting. What was your reaction when you heard him talk about his belief that even as a Democrat, he wants to see Democrats lose because of their stance on the war in Gaza?
I thought he actually accurately captured what I've heard from voters across a number of states for several months now, which is a lot of my reporting has been concentrated in Michigan, and the Arab and Muslim community there overwhelmingly supported Joe Biden in 2020, generally votes Democratic. And it was the same thing in Little Palestine. Most of these people voted for Biden 4 years ago and vote for Democrats up and down the ballot. And I think what they're grappling with is they feel this sense of betrayal and hurt at the way they believe the party has dealt with the war. I think they felt like Democrats cared more about their community and were better for their community than Republicans. And for many of the people I've spoken to, they feel like the way Biden has handled the war has upended that entire understanding. I mean, I think there is such a deep sense of anger and betrayal among many of these voters.
Mm-hmm. But for this man, for him to say that he actually thinks it's more important for Democrats to lose in this election, to me, I guess the obvious question is, but like, what would that actually mean for the future of the war? Like, are people in Gaza better off with President Trump in office versus I guess back then a President Biden. Now it would be a President Harris. But like, did he put that to him? What does he say about the cost of really believing that maybe Democrats should lose this election?
We asked pretty much everyone we spoke to that question, and they do not think Trump would be any better for the war in Gaza. But I think there are a couple different reactions to that question. One is, how much worse can it get than it's been? You know, at this point, we have Palestinians who have been killed throughout the war, a horrific humanitarian situation, starvation that's been sort of rampant for several months now. And so I think there is one school of thought that is, how much worse could it be with Trump? It's not going to be better, but can we argue that what's happened is better than what would have happened in an alternative universe if Trump were in office? And I think the other piece of this, and probably the more important piece of this, is they don't want Democrats to take their votes for granted anymore. And I think there are many people who feel this would be a price they have to pay right now in an effort to try to change Democratic policy on Israel and Palestine longer term.
So I know that there are plans for a march at the DNC to protest the Biden administration's handling of the war in Gaza. I'm curious, what did Fadi Sahori say about whether he might participate in that march? So
Fadi had every intention of participating in the protest.
The least we can do is just to go and shout. That's the least, that's هذا أضعف الإيمان. I don't know if you know what that means, but
what does that mean?
The least of the faith, like the least thing that you can ever do is just to go out and shout. But
he said, even if it meant risking violence, not him inciting it, but if there were any sort of violent response from the police or just the protest got out of hand, that was more than a price he was willing to pay because of what he knew people were going through. And everyone we spoke to said they fully intended to show up at the DNC and to protest and to, I think, try to make it a sort of uncomfortable event for Democrats in many ways.
And Yasmin, I'd be curious to hear your sense of what the potential consequences of that could be. Because you talked about the pretty narrow margin that we're looking at in Michigan. And as you point out, there are a lot of Arab and Muslim Americans in Michigan. If this protest is big enough or gets enough headlines, could it have real effects in swing states where Democrats are depending on being able to win that state?
Michigan is a must-win state for the Democrats. They could potentially win without it, but it would be a very difficult path, and they need Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin to basically assure their victory in the presidential election. And so if this community as a whole, it's about 200,000 Arabs and Muslims in Michigan who are registered voters. If they collectively decide to withhold their votes or stay home in very large numbers, that has the ability to swing the election. And I think equally important to Democrats is people are not just looking at the presidential race, they are looking down ballot as well. When I've visited Michigan, when I spoke with people in Little Palestine, they were very aware of the various stances that their local congressmen and senators had taken, and they will decide their votes based on that as well. So in states where they do make up a significant part of the population, they could in part dictate how well Democrats perform up and down the ballot.
I also think it's just interesting to acknowledge how much has changed so quickly in news generally, and specifically when it comes to this election, that a few months ago, I mean, this seemed like the biggest story in the country, the protests about the war in Gaza, the ways in which this was, really a profoundly divisive issue. And I think that's still there, but it also feels like with so much changing in the election right now that maybe it's not really top of mind for everyone anymore.
I think that's exactly right, Martine. The dynamics of the race have shifted so considerably in the last couple weeks since Vice President Harris became the nominee. And you're right that the war is not front and center for most Americans or for most Democrats the way it was a few months ago. Obviously, for these communities that we're talking about, it is still front and center. It is still going to dictate how they vote in many cases. But when you're talking about the party more broadly, I think it's not clear that it's going to be the decisive issue that it looked like it could have been a few months ago. And I think there's a couple different reasons for that. I think people held President Biden much more directly responsible for the policy than they do Vice President Harris. And she also just has a type of momentum behind her right now that President Biden never had. And so she is now leading in a couple of polls. She is narrowly leading in some battleground states. But I think at this point, it's hard to say just how much this will or won't matter in the grand scheme of things, because there are, of course, other issues like the economy, like immigration, like abortion that matter more to a larger number of voters.
But it's so complicated, right? Because there are also costs to Democrats for appearing to stray too far from support of Israel. I mean, there are a lot of Americans who feel very strongly about that and say, my vote for Democrats is dependent on whether or not you are doing right by Israel. So, Yasmin, do you have a sense of how much of the Democratic Party believes that Biden has handled the war appropriately?
It's a great point to make, Martine, because this is not an easy issue for any Democrat to sort of thread the needle on, because you're absolutely right. There is a strong contingent of pro-Israel Democrats, and we know a number of those Democrats were very angry at President Biden for suspending a single shipment of bombs. At this point, we know from polling that most Democrats support a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. And I think it's important to note that in Israel, a lot of people want a permanent ceasefire because they want the hostages home. And there have been these massive demonstrations against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu because a lot of people in Israel want the ceasefire, they want the war to end, they want the hostages home. And we know that there are a number of Democrats who feel President Biden was too deferential to Netanyahu through his handling of the war. I think you would find the party very deeply divided over the idea of conditioning aid to Israel, and you can see that in some votes that have come up in Congress. But the party has shifted significantly in the course of this war, in that you now have Democratic senators who have voted in support or indicated support for conditioning weapons sales to Israel, which is a huge shift. So you can see how much this war has changed the party's approach to Israel and how much it's divided it. I'll also note that throughout the course of this war, I have spoken to a number of pro-Israel Democrats who have a completely different view. They are fairly supportive of the way President Biden has approached the war and provided unconditional support of Israel. They point to the brutality of the Hamas attacks on October 7th.
He's been almost unconditional in his support of Israel, providing Israel with the weaponry that it needs to proceed its military and strategic goals.
One of the people I've spoken to throughout the course of this war is someone named Ron Halber, who is the head of a group called the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington.
And he has shown tremendous sympathy. And I don't think that Israelis take that for granted. I can tell you that President Biden is far more of a popular figure in Israel than the Prime Minister of Israel is.
So I think all of that illustrates the divide you're seeing in the party. There are the residents we are talking about in Little Palestine who see this as an atrocity that has gone pretty much unchecked by the United States. And there are the people who view this as Israel defending itself and argue that Hamas is the one putting Palestinian civilians in harm's way.
Thinking that Hamas gets to kill 1,200 people and then determine how the Israelis defend themselves, or to expect the Israelis to simply not defend themselves because they might hurt civilians, is ridiculous.
So, Yasmin, going back to Little Palestine, I want to hear a little bit more about the folks that you spoke to there and the places that you went. And specifically, I know you went to that mosque. Did you meet anyone around there that really stood out to you?
Well, one of the people who stuck with me the most from all the interviews we did is this young man named Hamza Abdul Qadir.
So my name is Hamza. I am a registered nurse. I have specialties is critical care. So I've been a registered nurse now for about 6 years.
And he actually went to Gaza for 2 weeks in March. He is a critical care nurse. And he said that he had basically been helplessly watching these videos for months of children dying or dealing with these catastrophic injuries without any pain relief or proper medical care. and he wanted to do something. So he volunteered with a group that sends medical workers into Gaza and described to us in detail the scenes he saw.
The second you cross that border, throw everything out the window. I had my expectations at zero. It was worse than I thought. It was worse than I could have ever possibly imagined. There were people in the streets everywhere. I mean, by the thousands. Donkey carts, wheelchairs, amputees, all over the streets.
And he said once he came back, there were certain images that stayed with him, including of a 5-year-old boy he took care of where they didn't have enough pain medication for him.
He woke up, ripped out his breathing tube. Every single day you walk into the ICU, you hear him screaming every day for his mom and dad.
And he just always thought of that when he heard President Biden speak, or every time a new weapons shipment was sent, that this little boy was just seared into his mind.
After the break, Yasmin breaks down how Vice President Harris has approached the war in Gaza and how voters in Little Palestine feel about her. We'll be right back. So, Yasmin, you went on this reporting trip at what eventually became the beginning of a very pivotal moment in politics. You went right after the presidential debate, and so there was just beginning to filter out this sense of, well, maybe Biden won't end up being the nominee. And in the weeks since, obviously, we've seen Kamala Harris come in to step in as the Democratic nominee. And I wonder how much that changes the viewpoints of the folks that you talk to. And I guess I want to start by asking, are we actually seeing a shift in how she is approaching the issue of the war in Gaza?
I think the way you ask that question is important because Kamala Harris talks about the war very differently from President Biden.
How so?
She has pretty much from the beginning, or at least maybe about 2 months into the war, where she has centered Palestinian suffering much more in her remarks than President Biden has been willing to. And we've often seen that she is one of the first high-ranking administration officials to start markedly shifting the tone of the way they're talking about the war.
Today, I had productive meetings with the leaders of the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt.
She gave a speech in Dubai near the end of last year where she was actually there for the annual UN climate conference, but decided she was going to use the opportunity to address the war and meet with a number of Arab leaders in person, which President Biden had not been able to do at that point. And she spoke in explicit terms about the suffering that was taking place on the ground.
Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. The scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating. I have spoken with members of the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities of America, including those who have lost loved ones in Gaza and American citizens who were injured and evacuated from Gaza. It is truly heartbreaking.
And one of the major criticisms of President Biden's handling of the war is not just the actual policy, but his rhetoric around it, that he hasn't shown sufficient empathy for Palestinian suffering. He at one point dismissed the Palestinian death toll and over a number of months had to sort of try to walk that back as this became a bigger issue for him. But Vice President Harris has not actually come out with a different policy or disavowed the administration's policy. That's not really something she can do while she's still the vice president. But we have not seen her actually say what she would do differently from President Biden. What we've seen from her in just a couple of weeks that she's been the Democratic nominee is she's tried to strike a tone where she speaks more forcefully about the responsibility that Israel bears for the situation in Gaza. She makes pretty forceful calls for a ceasefire without breaking from President Biden's policy. And she also always reiterates that Israel has a right to defend itself. So you can see her trying to thread the needle. But for some of these voters who had vowed not to support Biden, they are open to her, but not until she actually says what her policy is or she distinguishes herself in some way.
Interesting. So it sounds like even though there is a little bit of daylight between how Vice President Harris talks about the war in Gaza and about Israel's role in that versus how President Biden has been talking about that, there's still, like, people have not been, and specifically Palestinian Americans, have not been completely won over by that. And I think it's notable that we saw in her rally in Michigan last week that there were protesters there who were shouting genocide at her. Maybe you can speak a little bit about that moment.
I found that moment pretty striking for a couple different reasons. President Biden, over the last 10 months, basically, could not do a political event that was not interrupted by protesters. And you saw his campaign and the White House apparatus taking steps to try to limit interruptions. It's been kind of striking that Kamala Harris has been able to do a number of these huge events with thousands, 10,000, sometimes more people without facing the same kind of interruption. But it did happen at this Michigan rally, which is not a huge surprise. It was in Detroit, and the Detroit metro area has one of the largest Arab and Muslim population in the country.
He intends to cut social...
Protesters had interrupted her a few times, and it sounds like she maybe tried to wait it out, and then when she was being continually interrupted, said, if you want Donald Trump elected...
You know what? If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that, otherwise I'm speaking.
And that elicited huge, huge cheers from the crowd. I think there are some Democrats who are pretty impatient now with protesters who have shown up at these events. But you also had some saying, she could have said that she hears them and they're working
engaged with them more, communicated that she understood where they were coming from in terms of their feeling like this is a life or death issue to be like demanding attention on.
Exactly. There are very mixed responses. Obviously, the crowd had a pretty enthusiastic response to her shooting down the protesters, and people argued she did tolerate it for a little bit and they wouldn't stop. But I think there were some other people who felt that could have maybe been handled in a more compassionate way.
Though I will say that Harris did seem to change tactics in this other rally that she did last week in Arizona, where instead of shutting protesters down, she said she respects their voices and she reiterated her stance on a ceasefire deal. But Yasmin, I am curious, have you had a chance to go back to some of the people that you talked to in Little Palestine? Because I would want to get a sense from them about whether Harris, now being the Democratic nominee, if they are more open to voting for her, if they're more open to voting for Democrats now, and if they're moving away from this idea that essentially Democrats need to lose in November to understand that they can't take the Muslim and Arab American voting bloc for granted.
I did call a number of people back. And one of those people was Hamza, the nurse who went to Gaza for 2 weeks.
Hi, Hamza. This is Yasmin.
Hi, Salam. Yasmin, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Good, alhamdulillah.
And I asked him if anything changed about his plans for the DNC or to vote for Democrats in the election now that it was Kamala Harris instead of Joe Biden. And he sounded sort of exasperated and said nothing had changed because Kamala Harris hadn't actually laid out anything differently. And he was actually frustrated at some members of his community who seemed to be ready to vote for her or close to ready to vote for her, even though she had not actually laid out a different policy platform.
I mean, she comes from the same administration. She comes from the same party. So there really is no different view between her and Biden. We can all take the scapegoat that is the president of the United States and Biden, but we know that the government is much bigger than one man. So they're all complicit, in my opinion. And I share the view with many people that I know. So the view is unchanged.
But I think there are more people who are in a sort of wait and see approach. The door is cracked open. We're not shooting it down, but she needs to do something to distinguish herself from President Biden and his policy. I also went back to a couple of the protest organizers to ask if their plans had changed at all, and they said it had not changed at all. One of the people I spoke with in Little Palestine forwarded me a letter that a contingent of Arab and Muslim and pro-Palestine groups sent to Kamala Harris last week, laying out what it would take to win their vote. And they lay out a number of policies they want her to adopt. And so a couple of the key ones are that they want her, as part of the DNC platform, to demand an immediate and permanent ceasefire. They want her to condition aid to Israel, that they are on the condition that they are compliant with international humanitarian law and rulings from bodies like the UN and the International Court of Justice. They want assurances that the U.S. won't engage in a broader war. There are a lot of fears of this right now as attacks between Israel and Iran and Hezbollah are escalating. And there are a number of other policy demands, but those are probably the biggest key ones. And so they're trying to indicate to Kamala Harris that they are open to her, but this is what it's going to take.
So Yasmin, as you continue to report on this for the next few months leading up to November, what are the questions that you have about what we're going to see shake out and how much the issue of the U.S.'s role in the war in Gaza continues to be a prime kind of political divide within the Democratic Party?
So I have sort of a two-pronged approach to this. On the one hand, I'm really interested in how Kamala Harris continues to try to find a balance on talking about this issue. If at any point she at least indicates she might take a different approach to the war. The other side of this is Biden is still the president for 5 more months. And
how much can she sort of telegraph any shift in her thinking while he is in fact still in charge?
Exactly. She is in a bit of a delicate position where she is still his vice president. She's still his number 2. And she doesn't want to undermine the policy, especially while the Biden administration is still trying to negotiate an end to the war, which is looking just increasingly difficult and out of reach right now. But we know that President Biden really wants to find an end to this war, especially before he leaves office. I don't think he wants his legacy to be this war that continues to rage for years and years that happened under his watch, and that a lot of people will hold him directly responsible for. I think it's going to be important to watch how Kamala Harris talks about this and whether she finds a way to telegraph that she might want to take a different approach if she were president, and how she balances both the pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian contingents of her party, both of which have the ability to swing the election.
Yasmin, thank you for sharing your reporting on this.
Thank you.
Yasmin Abutaleb is a White House reporter for The Post. Before we go, The Post has been reporting on a bunch of different stories, and here are a couple that we wanted to share with you. We now have new details about a high-stakes national security investigation. Over the weekend, the Trump campaign announced that it had been a victim of a foreign hack. And on Monday, the FBI seemed to confirm it. The agency said it has been looking into suspected hacking attempts by Iran that targeted both the Trump and Biden-Harris campaigns. At least 3 staffers on the Biden-Harris campaign received phishing emails. So far, investigators haven't found evidence that those attacks were successful. But the hacking attempts seem to have compromised the communications with one person not formally connected to either campaign. That person is Roger Stone, a longtime friend and advisor to Trump. In an interview, he told The Post that his personal email accounts had been compromised. And if you're taking a trip to Italy this summer and doing some fine dining, you might see a lot of blue crab on the menu. That's because blue crab is an invasive species in the surrounding marine ecosystem. Some chefs are worried about the blue crab completely taking over, but others are adapting and using the crabs in creative ways. They're making filling for pastas, creating blue crab meatballs, and even pairing it with caviar. These new restaurant dishes are partly courtesy of climate change. The crabs are experiencing explosive growth because of sea level rise and because of excessive heat this summer. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you love the show and the kind of in-depth coverage that we've been doing this election season, you can help us out by spreading the word about Post Reports. Leave a rating on Spotify or a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help other people discover our podcast. Today's show was produced by Ariel Plotnick with help from Sabby Robinson. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Rena Flores. Thanks also to Naftali Ben-David. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.